I used the phrase a few minutes ago, reality outruns apprehension. This is actually a phrase from Moby Dick, not the part of Moby Dick that I will probably end up reading to you tonight. But what I thought would be interesting to talk about, basically because of its intrinsic interest and its recent intensification, is sort of the question, what is reality, number one, and then what's so great about it? And
why bother?
Yeah, why bother? I mean, we really have a bee in our bonnet about reality. When you get out of touch with it, this is considered not a good thing. Reality is the unmoving reference point in a universe of flux to which we are always supposed to go back and re-reference ourselves. And it's a funny concept. First of all, it is a concept. It's not an object with its own interior ontos. In other words, it doesn't have being outside of the culture's assumptions about it. This is the first big news about reality. The reality of the Witoto is a completely different reality from the West European or the Canadian. And yet the reality is, we assume that there is a kind of bedrock, and we call that reality, then everything is referenced back toward that. Well, I wanted to talk about it tonight because it's an incredibly slippery concept. I mean, I would say getting your hands on reality is about as likely as getting your hands on true love. You know, you're always going toward it or looking back at it, but you rarely have it in front of you in the moment. And yet the moment is where we spend most of our time. So we're kind of run ragged by the nostalgia for something we never knew, is what it almost comes down to. So, first of all, whenever we want to talk about something seriously and profoundly, we have recourse to science. However, reality is a term that, if it's used at all, it's used in philosophy, in ontology and epistemology. It is not a concept that you hear very often on the lips of scientists. Well, why is this? Well, it's because science, which is the enterprise which seeks to carry out a complete investigation of reality, has quickly satisfied itself that the beast can't be caged. It's very hard to actually come up with something concrete. And that's an interesting notion that any discussion of reality will tend to come back to. It wasn't until the 1930s that Alfred North Whitehead, in his book Process and Reality, created the great phrase that has now entered the language, the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. You've all probably heard this phrase, or maybe you haven't heard this phrase. But anyway, the fallacy of misplaced concreteness is the belief that there is something somewhere which is real, which can be depended upon, which everything else can be referenced back to. And as long as you are victim of this fallacy, you are philosophically naive and probably not at ease psychologically. Because, you know, it's like, as I said, nostalgia for something you never knew. The way science's method, which worked very well for the first 450 years, and by science, I don't mean science going back to the Greeks. I mean science since the Renaissance. Mathematically based Cartesian materialism is basically my notion of science. its method is what's called reductionism. This is the theory that if you want to understand something, an atom, a plant, a society, a geological formation, what you do is you take it apart. You deconstruct it. You dismantle it and catalog its parts and then define their relationships to each other. And then somehow when you recombine all these maps of this deconstructed object, you then somehow possess it. And this worked very well up until well into the 20th century, because it was assumed that matter, which was taken to be somehow a primary constituent of reality, that matter was made out of tiny billiard balls that were called Hamiltonian atoms, and that these distinct and concrete billiard balls could be located absolutely in time and space, and their relationships to each other defined as charge, force, momentum, spin, so forth and so on, and that out of these primary qualities, adhering to these elementary particles, notice these words primary, elementary, that are telling us we're getting close to bedrock, out of this you could reconstruct the world. The problem is, and I won't bore you with this because so many people have, quantum physics showed that these hard little billiard balls were the most tragic example of the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. They don't exist. There isn't such a thing. When you go down and down and down, suddenly everything becomes paradoxical. Ordinary logic no longer applies. And without beating a dead horse, I would remind you that quantum physics, quantum electrodynamics, which is always held up as the greatest intellectual edifice ever constructed by the mind of man, is a complete mess in terms of the aesthetic of its logics, because it requires two logics operating simultaneously. You have what is called ordinary logic, the logic that we as animals intuitively gravitate toward, logic which says things such as, if it is A, then it is not B, if it is now, then it is not then, if it is after, then it is not before. This is kind of logic that assumes concrete objects in a linear time stream. But quantum physics then, to solve the problems it sets itself, it requires another kind of logic, an extremely exotic logic called Boolean algebra. And so what you get when you look at a quantum mechanical explanation of nature is you get what are called isles of Boole embedded in ordinary mathematical logic. So there are actually transition zones, very distinct transition zones, where you simply switch logics in midstream, literally in midstream, in order to solve the problem. Well, this then gives you a nice set of numbers in an experimental situation where you're trying to calculate the charge of the electron or the displacement value of particles or something like that. But it rests on this completely inelegant switching back and forth from one logic to another as the case requires, which means the human observer is brought in and you get to decide which logic to use, and then you can use one for a few minutes and then switch back to the other and go back and forth. And upon such shifting sand as this, the entire edifice of science rests. Okay, well that's really all I want to say about the scientific view of reality. It's just to, yeah, Paul.
I just wanted to say that I'm not sure, I don't see science that way, and I think maybe one has to distinguish science and physics, because in the 19th century there were many physicists who realized and argued against the possibility of a mechanistic universe. and quantum mechanics was the final death toll of that point of view, but it was argued for 100 years and maybe 300 years before that mechanism can't exist, that reality doesn't exist.
You mean, are you thinking of vitalism?
No, I'm just thinking that it was clear to many physicists, at least in the last century, that we weren't going to be able. In other words, this notion of atoms was very clearly understood to be just a model. People, physicists at least, and some physicists, didn't confuse the notion of a model or a concept with reality. And in fact, argued quite clearly that these concepts aren't reality. In fact, we will never find a mechanism for our observations.
Yeah, well, the great enlightenment of 19th century physics occurred around the issue of fields, because until James Clerk Maxwell and Lorentz and these people wrote the equations for the electromagnetic field, it was denied that such a thing was possible, because it had this quality, this apparent quality of action at a distance. And that completely freaked out 19th century expectations of how nature should behave. We take this completely for granted. I mean, there's a radio sitting in this cabinet that we could flip on, and if we weren't in such a benighted geographical situation, we could hear hundreds of AM and FM radio stations. Well, those are wave mechanical systems that are filling this room, that are invisible to ordinary perception. To the 19th century mind, this was completely occult and astonishing. We take it for granted. Marshall McLuhan at one point suggested that the worldwide electrification of the planet through the spread of radio and television and electrical systems was actually the descent of the Holy Ghost into history, that electricity was the Holy Ghost to control and to understand, because we can do it. We don't need the second coming of Christ. We don't need divine intervention to destroy this planet. We can do it well enough on our own, thank you. So a huge responsibility evolves upon people within the global culture to try and come to terms with what is possible and what is to be done. And I think we have to doubt everything that we're told. All the ideology that we have inherited served a different kind of world. I mean, don't forget that as recently as 100 years ago, people believed that the Earth was created on September 15th, 4004 BC. I mean, the steam engine was the most powerful form of technology that existed. In the last 100 years, we have gone more than half of the distance that we've traveled in the last 50,000 years. And you can actually begin to see the outlines of what it's all about. As caretakers of the earth, as caretakers of intelligence, because this is all the intelligence that we know of, we must, in fact, come to terms with what is being asked of us. What is it that we are supposed to be doing? How can we rationally order our societies to maximize the values that we inherently and intrinsically feel to be worth saving? You mean why?
Causes to create culture.
Why did we fall into history?
Why did we create culture?
What were we afraid of?
What were we afraid of?
What were we afraid of? I've been reading Camille Paglia, and she says it's the...
You rascal.
Oh. Well, you know what she says.
Oh, I know what she says, yes.
So the chaos, the underworld, that quality, the violence of nature, the disorder.
Well, I think what happened, and you've all heard me talk about it in operational terms, that we were as embedded in nature as the fox and the leafcutter ant and the polar bear, until 100,000 years ago, or something like that. And then this ability to signify, it has something to do with our relationship to shamanism and psychedelic drugs. You see, when you look at primates of all types, going clear back to squirrel monkeys, you always get male dominance. Male dominance was not invented in the Middle East 3,000 years ago. Squirrel monkeys have alpha male primates, and anthropoid apes. All of the primates have this problem. But I really believe that we temporarily overcame it. About from, let's say, 25,000 years ago to 10,000 years ago, we temporarily overcame the tendency for male dominance to occur as a natural part of our being social animals. And this happened because shamanism evolved as an institution which relied on psychoactive plants to dissolve the male ego. And it's not only, we don't have to call it the male ego, that just polarizes and genderizes the thing. It's the ego. The ego is this strange transference of loyalty from the group to the self, the individual body. And then we call that the self. The reason so that psychedelic shamanism, specifically the use of psilocybin on the plains of Africa, was like a chemical inoculation against the formation of ego. And under the influence of psychedelic compounds, we evolved language and social roles and rudimentary agriculture and nomadism, all of these things. But then the psychedelic substances which made this possible began to become less and less available. This is simply because of climatic change in Africa. You see, the Sahara, what is now the Sahara Desert, was a veldt of grassland throughout prehistory. As late as Roman times, the Roman historian Pliny referred to North Africa as the breadbasket of Rome. It means that climatologically it was entirely different. And in that African theater, we emerged out of animal organization and into a world of language, cognition, ritual, ceremony, so forth and so on. And it was a style of psychedelic shamanism complexed with an orgiastic religious style. Now, the reason this is important, this orgiastic style, is because it makes it impossible to trace lines, lines of male paternity. Women know who their children are because they see their children come out of their bodies. But men couldn't know that. And so all values were group values. The tribe was as identified with true being as we now identify our ego. So people were altruistic, not in any holier than thou or pietistic way. It's just simply how they were, in the same way that the members of an anthill are altruistic. Ants don't flee from a problem because they're trying to save their own necks. They hurl themselves at the problem until it is solved, because conservation of the group values is the most important thing. Well, when...
But wait, so why instead of being a male society, why then couldn't this be passed on by the female? The female knows who her offspring is. Why?
But the female has built into her physiology a boundary-dissolving experience in the form of the birth experience. And in these African tribal societies, it didn't happen once or twice in a woman's life. It happened a dozen or 20 times. So women, by virtue of giving birth, and by virtue of this experience of seeing another person come out of their body, can never get so firmly embedded this notion of their inviolate and unique self. So it's just biologically scripted into femaleness that several times in your life you're going to be melted down into this situation, and it's a very deep imprinting. In the absence of psychedelic plants or drugs, a male can go from birth to the grave and never have this experience. And millions of people do that. And millions of people go from the birth to the grave without ever discovering the relativistic nature of the ego. They entirely identify it with the self, when in fact it isn't that at all. Now the mystery in all of this is the fact that it's kind of reductionist to say that taking these psychedelic plants dissolves the ego, because there has to be something then which rushes into this now empty space where the ego previously held sway. What rushes in to that liberated space is what I call the Gaian mind, that there is actually a hyper-intelligent being on this planet, or in this planet. It perhaps is this planet, but it is sentient. It thinks. It can communicate. We are like atoms inside the body, or cells inside the body of this enormous organism, which is the cause of our religious obsessing. The reason we're always running around looking for God Almighty is because we evolved on a planet inhabited by a super intelligence that we have lost contact with. And so we deny its intelligence. We, at this point, even deny its vitality. I mean, the Judeo-Christian shtick is that nature is to be at the service of man. And, this is a complete inversion of the idea that human beings should be the active hands of the Gaian mind. And this didn't happen for there's no bad guy in this scenario. It's simply that the climatological conditions which allowed this social mode that was characterized by nomadic pastoralism, orgy, and psychedelic shamanism was gradually replaced by, because of drying of the African continent, these psychedelic substances were no longer available. And there was even an intermediate phase where the psychedelic substance, if it was the mushroom, was preserved in honey, so that the great festivals became further and further apart in time, and the ego enters then like a tumor. It begins to form in the personalities of human beings. If you're engaging in psychedelic intoxication and orgy at every full moon, there is no chance for the ego to get a hold. I mean, it's just an aberration that everybody jumps on and is gotten rid of. But if these ceremonies become yearly or less frequent, then these funny notions get going in the more powerful males. Why shouldn't I control more females? Why shouldn't I have more of the food supply? Why shouldn't this area, in fact, be for me to hunt in alone? You get all these concepts of mindness that arise out of the growth of this tumorous, cancerous, maladaptive, self-defining, because that it doesn't serve. And we have committed ourselves to this thing so whole hog for the past 5,000-10,000 years that now we're so deep into it that it's not clear we can ever extricate ourselves from it, except, and this is the raison d'etre for my career, is we have to go back to the archaic solution, which is, and it can't be orgy. That can't be the archaic solution that we implement, because we're not a nomadic tribe of pastoralists, only 70 or 80 human beings. We're a global culture of 5 billion people. If we tried to resuscitate lunar orgies, we'd have a wave of social and sexually transmitted diseases that would probably finish us once and for all. So the orgy thing is not the answer, but the psychedelic option still exists. It still dissolves the ego, and it still puts you in contact with viable group values. So this is perhaps an answer. And I don't advocate it because I think it's a sure thing. I advocate it because I think it's the only game in town. Hell, if hortatory beating on people could have worked, then we would have solved all our problems thousands of years ago, because Buddha and Christ and all these other people, they had the right idea. It's just that ideas don't cut the mustard. It has to be an experience, a real experience. And a boundary-dissolving experience is so corrosive to all the institutions of dominator society that no religion in the West since has been able to come to terms with the psychedelic experience, because it mitigates male dominance, hierarchy, and all the other things that are the methods by which we do business.
Why do you think that nature would have it that there would be this window of opportunity to develop an ego to begin with? What?
Well, it was that we had a chemically mediated symbiosis with the Gaian mind, and it was it wasn't a locked symbiosis like you get in lichens or something like that. It was a kind of flirtation with symbiosis. It was that we took these psychedelic plants and contacted this hyperdimensional mind of nature, and discovered that because it was hyperdimensional, because it wasn't constrained in space and time the way we are, that it had useful information, very practical information. Where has the game gone? This is what shamans are good for, is to tell you where the game has gone. How will the weather be next year? Classical problem for shamans. Well, how do they know this stuff? So you see, shamanism is essentially a going into a higher dimension to obtain information that then feeds back into the group destiny. Well, how can these shamans know this stuff? How can they attain to this superhuman level of understanding? It's that they get in touch with a different kind of intelligence. An intelligence to whom where the game will be next year is as transparent as where the game was last year, because past and future don't exist for that intelligence. And our relationship to that intelligence was one of devotee to goddess, or supplicant to mystery. But eventually the connection was broken, and meanwhile the ego was arising, and the ego is like a mirroring of this larger psychic function. In other words, the ego is our pathetic attempt to create God on our own. This was Julian Jaynes' theory. He thought, you see, that up until as late as Homeric times, which is 800 BC, that if you got into a tight spot and were about to be offed or something, miraculously a voice would appear, would come on. It would just turn on in your head, and it would say, "You should get out of there." And people thought this was a god. It was a god. But eventually they were able to assimilate this psychic function into the personality. And then they said, well, that's not God talking. That's me. That's myself. And this is the idea where God is then located inside my body. And I take orders from this inner God that I call the ego. And if it is allowed to develop, and it's strange, it always develops along these patriarchal lines, you know. It brooks no babbling. It's not interested in argument. It knows what is to be done. And then the only time you get a problem is when you place one ego in contact with another. And then, of course, they go at it, hammer and tongs. But originally what we had was a symbiotic relationship with this Gaian mind. And this is the mystery that haunts this planet, haunts our history, haunts our psychedelic experiences and our dreams. It's that there really is a controlling super intelligence that can be contacted through psychedelic drugs, presumably religious practice, when you see how long they've been making the claim, although it must be a high noise signal when you do it that way, because they seem to get it always skewed off in some weird direction that then reinforces paternalistic institutions. But this is what all this goddess talk is about, is either we are becoming more sensitive to the presence of the Gaian mind, or the Gaian mind, under pressure of the approaching apocalyptic crisis, is beginning to raise its voice louder and louder and louder. So that now, you know, when you go into nature loaded, every rock, every tree, every stream is saying, awaken, awaken, come to focus. There's minutes to go, as William Burroughs likes to say, you know. So we have to connect up. And so we are, in a sense, the hands of this diffuse supermind that is spread through nature. And our presence as thinking, reflecting, culture-building individuals is not simply an amazing but meaningless set of circumstances. Our presence as a global technical civilization signifies the onset of the final crisis. It's as though, you know, you watch a pond and the surface is smooth, mirror smooth. Well, then the surface of the pond begins to churn. This is the signal that something huge is about to emerge out of the pond. And human history is that turbulence on the still surface of nature. Nature would never have allowed a phenomenon like human history to get going were it not in response to a deeply felt planetary crisis that is approaching at ever-accelerating speed. And I have enough faith in nature to believe that when the moment finally is upon us, we'll be ready. But the tools are being laid up right now. The ultimate tools, not the prototype tools. The bow and arrow, that was a prototype. The catapult, that was a prototype. The B-17, that was a prototype. But thermonuclear tipped intercontinental ballistic missiles, this is not the prototype. This is the actual instrument by which you could save a planet as well as destroy it, because you're at last dealing on the level of energies necessary to make those kinds of changes. And I think the evidence is all around us that the historical mode cannot persist. It can't. Just draw all the curves. Output of petroleum distillates, output of energy, population growth, proliferation of weapons. When you draw all of these curves, they can't be propagated 500 years into the future. Sometime in the next 50 years, we're going to have to make or break what history was all about. And the arising of global culture, the arising of an integrated electronic awareness, high-speed computational machinery, tremendously powerful weapons, spacecraft, all of this stuff looks to me like the raw material for a salvational exercise. And notice that it's not only a way to save the planet, it's in a sense a way to save not only ourselves, but to save our ancestors as well. This, if we can act in a moment of great crisis to preserve the planet from ruination, we will redeem human history. Then it all makes sense. The pogroms, the migrations, the brutality, the stupidity, it was all toward a purpose. And then somehow those lives that were lost in those pogroms and invasions and migrations and so forth are given meaning. A meaning which they will totally not have if we simply blow the planet apart and wreck nature and ruin the oceans and blow off the atmosphere. Then it just looks like a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury that signifies nothing. So it's as though the meaning itself is in our hands. What shall we make of this? Is it just, as James Joyce said, atoms and ifs? Or is there a plan, a process, a plot, and a role for us that will give us some dignity in this situation, which otherwise, up to this point, as far as I can see, we totally lack. I mean, it's all very well to spend an afternoon wandering around the Louvre, but on the other hand, spend the next day wandering around the slums of Calcutta, and you just really have to wonder about what the human enterprise is about.